The scent of burning hay still clung to my clothes as I stood barefoot in the ashes of my porch. Still, my son didn't meet my eyes, just called me homeless, like I was a headline, not his mother. As the wind carried the last ember across the blackened field, I clutched the phone I hadn't touched in 20 years. While they counted insurance money, I remembered a boy I once held when his parents forgot him. The same boy who now owned half the state and still signed his birthday cards, Little Elliot. That's when I made the call and rewrote the ending they thought they'd already buried me in. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Clara jolted awake to the stifling smell of smoke. The air was thick, and a haze of orange light bled through the curtains of her bedroom window. Her heart skipped a beat as she rushed to the window, throwing it open. Her worst nightmare was unfolding before her eyes. Her farm, her legacy, was burning. Flames danced across the barn, licking the sky, their crackling roar swallowing the morning air. She could hear the distant sound of sirens, but it was too late. The fire had spread too fast, fueled by dry timber and the unforgiving wind. She watched helplessly as the firemen, their bright yellow uniforms barely visible against the inferno, worked tirelessly but could not control the blaze. "Please," Clara whispered under her breath, but the fire only answered with a louder crack, the roof of the barn collapsing in a wave of sparks. She stumbled out of her bedroom, heart racing, and ran to the porch. The heat of the flames hit her like a wall, making her choke on the acrid air. She could feel the familiar soil beneath her bare feet, but it no longer gave her comfort. It only reminded her that everything was slipping away. David was there now, his truck screeching to a halt in the driveway. Clara's son jumped out, his face drawn with anxiety. He scanned the scene, his eyes wide with panic. But when he saw her, there was no rush to comfort, no outstretched arms. He didn't even move toward her. He walked briskly toward the fire chief instead. "How much damage?" David's voice was flat, detached. Clara's chest tightened. Her son had always been pragmatic, but this was different. It was as if the only thing on his mind was the money, the insurance, the numbers. "David!" Clara called, but her voice cracked under the weight of the flames and the growing knot in her throat. David turned, his face twisted in a mix of concern and frustration. "Mom, we need to figure out what we're going to do. The barn's gone. The crops, gone." His gaze shifted to the smoldering ruins. "The whole farm is a loss." Clara's heart sank. What about the house? What about everything? David paused, glancing over at Rebecca, who stood by the truck, arms crossed, looking unbothered by the chaos around her. "We're looking at tens of thousands of dollars in damage, Mom. How are we going to pay for all this?" Rebecca spoke up, her tone dismissive. "This isn't just about money. You've got nothing left, Clara. This place is gone. What are you going to do now?" Clara felt the sting of her daughter-in-law's words more sharply than the heat from the flames. She looked around, the memories of a lifetime gone in an instant, her husband's laughter echoing from the barn, the land they worked until the soil ran red with their sweat. How could they stand there, so cold and detached, as her entire world burned? David and Rebecca continued arguing, their voices rising. Clara felt a disconnect growing between them. The people who were supposed to support her now only saw her as a burden, a problem to solve. No one cared about her loss, her memories, her connection to this place. Suddenly, Clara was no longer part of the conversation. She was outside of it, her grief tangled with confusion and betrayal. She had always been strong, had always been the pillar of this family, but now she was invisible, an afterthought. The fire burned on. Clara didn't know how long she stood there, watching, helpless. She wanted to fight it. She wanted to scream, to tell them this was her home, her life. But no words came. The fire was finally contained, the firefighters exhausted. It was over. There was nothing left but charred wood and ash. David walked over to her, his hands shoved in his pockets, his face impassive. "You're homeless now, Mom," he said, his words sharp, cold, as if he was stating a fact rather than delivering a crushing blow. Clara's heart shattered. She had expected it. Somewhere deep down she had known. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing it come from her son, the only family she had left, was like a knife twisting in her chest. Homeless. Was that all she was now? She stood frozen, her mind reeling. The land that had given her life, her purpose, her pride, it was all gone. But what was worse was the emptiness that spread through her. The realization that the people who should have been there to help, to comfort her, had already written her off. The silence between them was deafening. And as David walked away, Clara's thoughts turned to the past, the time when she had been a young woman, full of hope and ambition. She had never imagined this moment. She had never imagined being alone, cast aside like an old tool that had outlived its usefulness. In that moment, as the sun began to set behind the smoke, Clara made a choice. She couldn't stay here. Not in this place, with these people. There had to be something more, something beyond the ashes. And so, she picked up her phone, her fingers trembling. There was one person she hadn't thought of in years, someone who might help. But could she reach out to him after all this time? Her heart pounded in her chest as she dialed the number she knew by heart. The past was calling, and Clara had no choice but to answer. The fire had long since been extinguished, but the weight of the loss hung over Clara like a thick, suffocating fog. The charred remains of the barn were still smoldering, sending up little curls of smoke into the cold morning air. The farm she had poured her life into, the land that had shaped her, now lay in ruins. She stood in the driveway, watching the last of the fire trucks pull away, their red lights fading into the distance like the last vestiges of a dream. Clara glanced around the property, her heart breaking anew. What was left? A house filled with soot and ash, a barn reduced to a skeleton of twisted metal and scorched wood, the garden where her husband had once toiled, now nothing but a patch of blackened earth. She had always believed the land would be there for her, a steady foundation. But now it was gone, and so was her place in the world. Her son and daughter-in-law had driven off hours ago, David's truck kicking up dust as it disappeared down the long road leading out of the property. They hadn't even said goodbye. Clara's neighbors passed by, some on foot, others in their trucks. Their faces were etched with sympathy, but no one stopped to offer help. They, too, were struggling, scraping by in a town where hope had been a scarce commodity for years. But Clara knew that even if they wanted to help, they had nothing to give. She had nothing to give them in return. She knelt down by the garden, her fingers brushing the earth she had worked with her husband for decades. It was lifeless now. What had once been a place of growth and bounty was now a graveyard of memories. The silence was oppressive. No voices to comfort her. No familiar presence to turn to. She felt a hollow ache in her chest, a deep emptiness that spread with each breath. There was no one left. No family. No home. Clara's hands trembled as she wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, brushing away the tears that had been falling without her even realizing it. Her son, her only child, had abandoned her, turned his back on her when she needed him the most. The pain of it was sharp, cutting through her like the wind that whipped around her. David's cold words echoed in her mind. "You're homeless now, Mom." The finality in his voice still stung, like a slap she couldn't escape. She had always been the strong one, the pillar of their family. But now, there was nothing left to hold her up. Rebecca's voice from earlier rang in her ears. "What are you going to do now?" It wasn't just a question, it was an accusation. Clara couldn't help but feel like a failure. She had given them everything. The farm. Her life. And this was how it ended. Alone. Homeless. There was no insurance to cover the loss. No money to rebuild. David had been right about that. She had made the mistake of thinking things would always be fine, of trusting that things wouldn't fall apart. The sun was beginning to dip behind the remnants of her barn, casting long shadows over the land. Clara stood up slowly, her knees stiff, the weight of the day pulling her down. She had to start packing. She had nowhere else to go. The thought of it made her stomach churn, but the reality was unavoidable. She moved to the house, gathering the few belongings that hadn't been damaged by the fire. Pictures of her husband, family heirlooms, the clothes she could salvage. But every item she touched felt heavier than the last. They were all pieces of a life that was slipping away from her. As she packed, her mind wandered. Her thoughts, unbidden, drifted back to a time long ago, a time before the fire, before the betrayal. She thought of Elliot Armstrong, the young boy she had once babysat. He was the son of a wealthy couple in the town, and she had spent afternoons watching him, teaching him how to ride a bike, how to plant a seed. He had been sweet and curious, a little mischievous, but she had always enjoyed the time they spent together. Elliot had been different from the other kids. Even at a young age, there was something about him that made him stand out, something bigger than the small town they had grown up in. She remembered how she had laughed with him about how much he would one day accomplish, how he'd outgrow their quiet, rural world. But as time passed, Elliot had moved away, and Clara had stayed, tied to the farm, to the land, to the life she and her husband had built. Elliot had gone on to do great things, becoming a billionaire, someone who could shape the world with his wealth. She hadn't heard from him in years. Clara paused, her hands stilling in the act of folding a blanket. Could she really call him? After all this time? She wasn't sure, but she couldn't think of anyone else. Her thoughts turned back to the phone in her pocket. She could feel the cold weight of it against her side, as if it were an anchor that would either pull her deeper into despair or pull her free from the wreckage. She wasn't sure what she expected from him. Sympathy? Charity? Or maybe just a lifeline, a hand to pull her out of this sinking pit she found herself in. She wasn't sure she deserved it, but what else could she do? Her fingers hovered over the phone, her heart pounding in her chest as the sun set behind the smoldering remains of the farm. The past, and the choices she made, seemed to whisper in her ear, but Clara wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. With a shaky breath, she pulled the phone from her pocket, staring at the number she hadn't dialed in so many years. Clara's fingers trembled as they hovered over the phone, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her chest. She hadn't spoken to Elliot Armstrong in years, decades really. The thought of calling him now, at this low point, made her feel small, vulnerable, like a ghost reaching out to the living. But she had no other choice. The people who should have cared, who should have helped, had turned their backs. Her son, her daughter-in-law. They were gone, as if the fire had burned away their connection to her too. She didn't know where else to turn. With a deep breath, she opened the contacts list, her thumb shaking slightly as it scrolled down to his name. Elliot Armstrong, the boy she used to babysit, the one who had become a billionaire. It felt surreal to even think about him now. What had happened to the young boy who had once looked up at her with curiosity, who had trusted her? Was he the same person now, or had his wealth and success made him unrecognizable? Clara's finger hovered over the dial button, but the doubts crept in. Would he even remember her? Would he laugh at the absurdity of her reaching out after so many years? After all, he had his own life now, filled with business deals, social events, and meetings that likely didn't have room for someone like her. She closed her eyes, feeling the tightness in her chest. No time like the present, she thought. She couldn't stay here, stranded with nothing. Her thumb pressed the dial button before she could talk herself out of it. The phone rang twice, then a voice answered, familiar, but distant. Hello? Clara froze for a moment. It had been so long. She couldn't recall exactly what she had planned to say. Her mind raced, a jumble of words and emotions. Finally, she found her voice, hoarse but determined. Hi, Elliot, she said, her words tentative. I don't know if you remember me, but it's Clara Williams. I used to babysit you when you were a boy. There was a pause on the other end, a rustle like he was sitting up straighter. Clara? His voice was a bit softer now, as if he was processing who she was. Wow, it's been a long time. I remember you well. How have you been? Clara's breath caught, a strange warmth flooding her chest at the sound of his recognition. For a moment it felt like nothing had changed. She was just Clara, the same woman she used to be when she took care of a young, bright-eyed boy who had dreams much bigger than the small town they both came from. I'm afraid it's not been good, Elliot, Clara said, swallowing the lump in her throat. My farm burned down. Everything is gone. My son and his wife. They've turned their backs on me. I don't have anywhere else to go. Elliot's voice softened further, a note of concern entering. I'm so sorry to hear that, Clara. That sounds awful. I can't imagine what you're going through. Clara's stomach twisted as she fought back tears. She hadn't expected this level of empathy. I know it's been a long time since we spoke. I'm sorry to bother you with this, but I didn't know who else to turn to. No, you're not bothering me, Elliot said quickly. Well, I'm shocked, of course, but I'll help. Of course I'll help. Clara's heart gave a quick, erratic beat at his offer. The relief was almost overwhelming, but it came with its own weight. She wasn't sure what it meant, or how she would feel accepting help from someone who had been so far removed from her life for so long. Elliot continued, his voice steady. Look, you're welcome to stay with me. I have plenty of room here. I'm sure we can figure something out. No one should go through something like that alone. Clara's hands clenched around the phone. He meant it. She could hear the sincerity in his voice, the genuine concern that seemed to break through the distance of the years. But as the words settled, a wave of embarrassment washed over her. What had she become? Asking for help. Especially from someone like him, someone with so much, someone who had moved so far beyond this small town and the life she had built. She had always prided herself on independence, on standing on her own 2 feet. You don't have to do this, she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. I know I'm asking a lot. Clara, you're not asking a lot, Elliot responded firmly. You're asking for help. And that's okay. Please, just come. Let's figure this out together. There was something reassuring in his words, something that calmed the frantic pulse of anxiety in her chest. She had no plan, no idea what to do next. But maybe this was a start. Maybe, just maybe, reaching out to the past wasn't such a terrible thing after all. But even as she agreed to come, another thought lingered at the back of her mind. What would it be like? She hadn't seen Elliot in years, and he had become someone entirely different from the boy she used to know. What had his life become? What would it mean for her to step into his world now, so unfamiliar, so foreign? The silence between them stretched, and Clara took a steadying breath, realizing she was already on the edge of something that could change everything. Her life, her future, her place in the world. It was all about to shift. Thank you, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with all the gratitude she hadn't known how to express until now. You don't have to thank me, Elliot replied, and Clara could hear the faintest smile in his voice. Just get here safe. I'll be waiting. And as the line went quiet, Clara held the phone in her hand, feeling a strange sense of hope begin to stir in her chest. But that hope was fragile, uncertain, because nothing could prepare her for the world she was about to step into. The car rolled slowly up the long, winding driveway, its tires crunching over the gravel. Clara's hands gripped the seat beneath her, knuckles white, her heart thudding in her chest. The estate before her was a sprawling testament to wealth, miles of perfectly manicured grounds, fountains that sparkled in the sun, and a mansion that loomed large, with windows reflecting the clear blue sky like cold, impassive eyes. She had seen places like this in magazines, on TV shows, but standing here, at the threshold of it all, felt surreal. She couldn't help but compare it to the modest farmhouse she had spent her life in, wooden beams that creaked with age, fields that had been worked by calloused hands, the smell of the earth always fresh and familiar. This world, this luxury, was foreign to her. And yet, it was a world Elliot had built for himself. A world that felt like a lifetime away from her own. As the car came to a stop in front of the grand entrance, Clara opened the door and stepped out, her feet unsteady on the cobblestones, her boots clicking sharply against the stone. A rush of cool air hit her face, carrying with it the scent of flowers and freshly cut grass. She took a deep breath, but it didn't calm her. It only made her feel more out of place, like she didn't belong here. Elliot was already standing on the front steps, a tall figure framed by the doorway. He smiled warmly as he saw her, and for a moment she was reminded of the young boy she had known all those years ago. There was a kindness in his eyes that hadn't changed, even as the years had turned him into someone far beyond the small-town life they had once shared. "Clara," he said, his voice filled with surprise and warmth, "you made it." I did," she said, her voice sounding smaller than she meant it to. She had expected him to look at her with curiosity, maybe even awkwardness, but instead, there was nothing but compassion in his gaze. Elliot stepped forward, pulling her into a brief but heartfelt hug. For a moment, Clara allowed herself to lean into it, the comfort of a familiar embrace she hadn't realized she was craving. She felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. She didn't want to appear weak, especially not now, not in front of someone who had his whole life figured out. Come in," Elliot urged, leading her through the enormous front door into a lavish foyer. The ceilings were high, the floors polished marble that reflected the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. Clara's footsteps seemed to echo in the vastness of the space. As they moved further into the house, Clara couldn't help but feel a wave of discomfort wash over her. The furniture was pristine, untouched, like it had never seen the mess of everyday life. Everything felt too perfect, too curated, and Clara felt like an intruder, someone who didn't belong in this world of polished surfaces and cold elegance. "Can I get you something to drink?" Elliot asked, his tone still warm and casual. "No, thank you," Clara replied quickly, her throat tight. "I'm fine." Elliot didn't press, instead offering a small smile. "You can rest. Get settled in. I've got plenty of rooms for you." Clara nodded, but as she followed him down a hall that seemed to stretch forever, she couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. Every step she took made her feel more like an outsider. The walls were adorned with expensive artwork, the floors covered with rugs so fine they looked like they belonged in a museum. There was no dust, no clutter, no sign of the lived-in mess that had been her life. They reached a guest room at the end of the hall, and Clara was grateful for the privacy it promised. Elliot pushed open the door, revealing a room that could have been in a luxury hotel. Soft, cream-colored linens, a massive four-poster bed, and windows that framed the vast, perfectly kept garden outside. This will be your room while you're here, Elliot said, his voice gentle. Make yourself at home. I'll let you settle in, but when you're ready, we can talk more. About everything. Thank you, Elliot, Clara said, her voice filled with gratitude, though it felt heavy on her tongue. She didn't know how to ask for this, how to accept this kind of kindness without feeling like she was imposing. Before he left, Elliot gave her a reassuring smile. Take your time. I'm right down the hall if you need anything. Once he was gone, Clara closed the door behind him and sank down onto the edge of the bed. Her eyes scanned the room, so perfect, so beautiful, and yet so empty. It was a stark contrast to her own life, the farm that had been so full of love, laughter, and warmth. A life that was now reduced to ashes. Clara pulled her knees to her chest and buried her face in her hands. She wanted to believe that this was the beginning of something better, that she could start fresh in this new world Elliot had offered her. But the weight of her loss felt suffocating. The fire had stolen everything, and now she was in a place that was so far removed from the life she had known, she didn't know how to fit into it. As she sat there, trying to make sense of everything, the sound of footsteps outside the door interrupted her thoughts. Clara wiped her eyes quickly, and before she could compose herself, the door opened. A young woman stepped into the room. Elliot's daughter, Clara presumed. She had long, dark hair that cascaded down her back in soft waves, and a look in her eyes that was both curious and cautious. I'm Sophie, she said, offering a small smile. You must be Clara. My dad mentioned you were here. Her tone was polite, but there was an edge of something Clara couldn't quite place. Maybe it was suspicion, or maybe just curiosity. Either way, Clara felt like she was under a microscope. Yes, I'm Clara. It's nice to meet you, Clara said, standing up awkwardly, unsure whether she should extend her hand or just wait. Sophie studied her for a moment, her gaze flicking to Clara's worn clothes before settling back on her face. How did the fire happen? What exactly happened to the farm? Clara's stomach tightened, the question feeling more like an interrogation than a casual inquiry. It wasn't her fault. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. But she still felt herself faltering under Sophie's gaze, as if the weight of her loss wasn't enough to make her feel exposed. It was a fire. I lost everything, Clara said, her voice thick. The farm, my home, my son. He doesn't want anything to do with me anymore. She bit back the lump in her throat. Sophie nodded, but Clara could see the faint flicker of judgment in her eyes. As if Clara was just another casualty of the fire, someone who had fallen out of the world Sophie knew, someone too different from her reality to understand. Clara could feel the walls between them, the gulf that separated her past from Sophie's present. And just as quickly as it had appeared, that faint connection she'd felt with Elliot seemed to vanish. She was back to being an outsider, uncertain of her place in this world. As Sophie stepped back into the hallway, Clara stood there, a sudden wave of loneliness crashing over her. She had no idea what she had walked into, and the truth was, she didn't know if she was strong enough to face it. And yet, somehow, she had to try. The days blurred together in a haze of unfamiliarity. Clara had spent her first few nights in Elliot's mansion in a kind of stunned daze, as though her brain was too overwhelmed to process anything properly. She spent her mornings staring out the window, watching the gardeners trim the hedges and the staff move in and out with trays of food. She'd never seen so much beauty in one place. The gardens, the fountains, the crisp, perfectly aligned rows of flowers. It all felt like a dream or a nightmare. But as the days passed, the weight of her grief began to ease, ever so slightly, as she started to occupy herself with small tasks around the house. Elliot, ever the gracious host, had given her space. but he also encouraged her to help with the daily routines. She'd dusted shelves in the library, helped arrange flowers in vases, even folded laundry. It was mundane, simple work, but it brought a sense of normalcy she hadn't realized she'd been craving. The house, cold and sterile at first, began to feel a little more like home. Every dish she polished, every rug she fluffed, made her feel like she was contributing to something, even if it was just a small part of Elliot's world. It was hard not to feel like a stranger here, but the simple tasks made her feel useful again, like she wasn't just a guest in someone else's life. But it wasn't just the work inside the house that brought her some peace. Elliot had suggested she take the afternoons to explore the city, to see what the world beyond the estate had to offer. Clara had been hesitant at first, but eventually she found herself wandering through the streets of the city. The noise, the bustle, the sheer energy of it all was overwhelming at first, but as she explored more, it started to feel like a new kind of adventure. One afternoon, Clara wandered into a small cafe and struck up a conversation with the barista. Her name was Sarah, and she had a warmth that Clara hadn't realized she'd missed. They talked about everything: how Sarah had moved from a small town just like Clara's, the struggles of finding community in a big city, and the joy of simple things like coffee and books. Clara felt a flicker of connection, something that had been missing from her life for so long. It was in those moments of human connection, of small interactions, that Clara began to rebuild herself. The walls she had put up to protect her heart slowly began to crumble. She realized that she didn't need to shut herself off from the world. She could still be a part of it, even if it felt completely foreign to her now. As the days turned into weeks, Clara found herself volunteering at a local food bank. It was a small charity, but it meant everything to her. The people there were kind, the work was tangible, and for the first time since the fire, Clara felt like she was doing something that mattered. She spent her afternoons sorting donations, helping prepare meals, and organizing community outreach programs. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The act of helping others, of giving back in even the smallest way, began to fill the empty spaces in Clara's heart. She realized that in the process of helping others, she was also helping herself. The world outside her grief still had beauty and kindness, and she could be a part of it, even if she was no longer tied to the farm or her family. One evening, as she sat down with Elliot over dinner, he brought up something that Clara hadn't expected. "You've been doing a lot of good work at the food bank, Clara," Elliot said casually, sipping his wine. "It's been really inspiring to see. Have you thought about sharing your story with some of my associates? You've got a lot of wisdom, a lot of life experience that could resonate with others in the community." Clara froze. Her fork hovered halfway to her mouth, the food in front of her suddenly losing its appeal. She had never thought of her story as something that could help others. She'd always been just Clara, wife, mother, farmer. Now she was a woman without a farm, without a family, trying to make her way in a world that had left her behind. "I'm not sure," she said slowly, putting the fork down. "I've never been one to talk about myself. About, about everything I've been through. I don't know if I want to share it with anyone. I'm still trying to figure it out myself." Elliot leaned forward, his expression gentle but insistent. "Clara, your story is powerful. People can learn from what you've been through. You're more than just a woman who's lost everything. You're a woman who's starting again. And that's something worth sharing." Clara sat back in her chair, her mind swirling. The idea of standing in front of people, of opening up about everything she had lost, terrified her. But at the same time, there was something freeing in the thought. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding, to stop being ashamed of her past. For so long, Clara had defined herself by her farm, by her family, by the life she had built with her husband. When that was all taken from her, She felt like she had nothing left. But here, in this foreign place, she was slowly beginning to see that she didn't need the farm to define her. She was more than just what she had lost. "I'll think about it," Clara finally said, her voice quiet but firm. She knew, deep down, that sharing her story wasn't just about helping others. It was about reclaiming herself, about finding her voice in a world that had moved on without her. Later that night, as she stood by the window in her guest room, looking out over the vast estate, Clara realized that she was starting to see herself differently. She wasn't just a woman who had lost everything. She was a woman who had survived, who was beginning to rebuild. And she had something to offer the world beyond the ashes of her past. Her journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Clara felt like she might just be able to find her way forward. Clara was sitting on the balcony of Elliot's mansion, the evening air cool and fragrant with the scent of flowers, when the call came. It was the kind of phone call she had almost forgotten to expect, an interruption to the peace she had been slowly finding in her new life. The screen lit up with a name she didn't recognize, and for a moment Clara hesitated, unsure if she even wanted to answer. She had grown accustomed to the stillness here, to the comfort of the routine she had built. Volunteering, small talks with neighbors, the occasional long walk through the city. It was safe, familiar, and above all, it was far from the chaos of her past. But that same silence had begun to gnaw at her. She wasn't truly living. She was existing. Taking a breath, Clara swiped to answer. "Hello?" Her voice felt hesitant, unsure. "Clara Williams?" The voice on the other end was smooth, confident, a slight southern drawl adding a warm richness to the words. "This is Jack Wilkes. I'm a business partner of Elliot's. I hope I'm not interrupting." Clara's brow furrowed, her mind racing to place the name. "Jack Wilkes?" "Yes, of course. I remember Elliot mentioning you." "Well, Clara, I'm glad I could catch you. The reason I'm calling is because we've got a new project in the works, and I'd like to offer you an opportunity to be part of it." Clara's pulse quickened. She hadn't expected this. "A project?" she asked, her voice threading with curiosity. "Yes, a sustainable farming initiative we're starting. We're focusing on bringing innovation and sustainability to the agricultural sector, particularly in rural communities. With your background, Clara, your expertise, we think you'd be a perfect fit. The role would involve advising and overseeing some of our early-stage projects. We're looking for someone who understands the land, understands what real farming is about." The words hit Clara like a shock. Her hands tightened around the phone, her mind swirling. Sustainable farming? Her life had been farming. Her entire world had been wrapped in it. Yet the idea of being involved in something so large, so corporate, felt like a stretch. Could she really step back into that world after everything that had happened? "But," Clara said slowly, "I'm not sure I'm the right person. I've been out of the field for a while now. I'm not familiar with the corporate side of things, the kind of work you're describing. I don't know if I have the skills for it." There was a pause on the other end, and then Jack's voice softened, reassuring. "Clara, you know the land better than anyone. No one understands what it takes to grow something real, to work with the earth, like you do. And that experience, well, it's invaluable. You don't need to worry about the corporate side of things. We'll have the support in place to handle that. We need your insight, your vision, the real-world perspective." Clara's heart hammered in her chest. It sounded like something she could believe in, something that could change everything. But could she really step back into farming? A part of her was still raw from losing her own land, the fire, the betrayal of her son and daughter-in-law. The idea of working for a company, advising on projects that weren't hers, felt like opening an old wound. "I'll need time to think about it," she said softly, her voice wavering despite her attempt to stay composed. I understand, Jack replied. Take all the time you need. But I'm telling you, Clara, this is a chance to make a real impact. Not just on your own life, but on farming as a whole. It's a big opportunity, and I think you'd be an asset. The words echoed in her ears long after she hung up the phone, a combination of excitement and trepidation swirling inside her. She felt something stir, something she hadn't felt in so long. Purpose. Clara stepped back from the balcony, the evening air now a distant memory. She was standing in the middle of a crossroads, one path leading her deeper into this life she had stumbled into, the other pulling her back into the world of the farm, of the land. It was a chance to rebuild what she had lost, not just for herself, but for the future of farming, of sustainability. But that same future scared her. She had been burned once. Could she really trust herself to take that step again? She found Elliot in the study later that evening, his face soft in the dim light from the desk lamp. She told him about the call, about the opportunity Jack had offered her. Elliot listened intently, his expression thoughtful. I think it's a great opportunity, he said after a long pause. You've always been so connected to the land, Clara. It's part of who you are. And this could be a way to not only find your place again, but to make a difference in a way that's bigger than anything you've done before. I don't know, Clara said quietly, still unsure. It feels overwhelming. What if I'm not good enough for something like this? Elliot leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Clara, you're stronger than you think. You've been through so much already. You've lost everything, and you're still standing. What could be scarier than that? Her chest tightened as the weight of his words settled in. He was right. She had been through the fire, literally and figuratively, and she had survived. I'll think about it, Clara said, her voice steadier now, as a sense of clarity began to form in her mind. The idea of returning to farming, of using her knowledge and experience to make a real difference was daunting, but it was also thrilling. This wasn't just about reclaiming what she had lost. It was about shaping the future. And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt a spark of hope. As she sat there, thinking about what Jack had said, she realized that the choice wasn't just about farming. It was about who she wanted to be now. And for the first time since the fire, Clara felt like she had the power to choose. The first few weeks with the Sustainable Farming Initiative were a whirlwind. Clara had expected to feel out of place in the corporate world, but the reality was far more overwhelming than she had imagined. The language was unfamiliar. Terms like ag tech, smart irrigation, and crop yield optimization seemed to fill every conversation. There were endless meetings, strategy sessions, and endless piles of data to sift through. It was a sharp contrast to the straightforward life she had known on her farm, where decisions were made by the seasons and the soil, not by algorithms or spreadsheets. At first, Clara stumbled. She sat in boardrooms, trying to digest concepts that made her head spin. But with each meeting, she felt herself catching on a little more. She began to understand how technology could be used to improve what she had spent decades learning to do by hand. The idea that sustainability could be paired with innovation felt like a lifeline, like a bridge between the world she had lost and the future she was now a part of. One morning, she met with a group of agronomists, engineers, and environmental scientists who specialized in precision farming. They showed her a new method of monitoring soil health, a high-tech system that used sensors to track moisture levels, nutrient content, and temperature. It was all cutting edge, yet Clara saw the connection to what she had always done, the idea of nurturing the soil, of ensuring its health for the future, was something she had always believed in. It was just a new way of doing it. The more Clara learned, the more she felt herself growing into her new role. She began to realize that this wasn't just about farming, it was about making a real, lasting impact on the world. She was part of something bigger now. Every piece of technology, every strategy, every connection she made felt like a new tool in her arsenal, a way to help farmers, like herself, create something sustainable and long-lasting, even in the face of challenges. At times, she still felt like an outsider, sitting in high-rise offices, surrounded by people who had never seen a field of corn or harvested a tomato. But then, when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, filled with the wisdom of years spent working the land. She was no longer just a woman mourning her past. She was a leader, shaping the future of farming, helping it adapt to the modern world. It wasn't long before Clara was asked to mentor a group of young farmers who had joined the initiative. They were eager, enthusiastic, but lacked the deep, grounded knowledge that Clara had. At first, she hesitated. What could she teach them about the future of farming when she had barely navigated it herself? But as she began to work with them, to share her experience and insights, something clicked. She saw herself in them, young, hopeful, and ready to make a difference, just as she had been years ago. She showed them how to read the land, how to understand its rhythms, and how to adapt to the changing seasons. And, in return, they taught her things she had never known: how to integrate new technologies into her methods, how to leverage data to improve efficiency. The exchange was symbiotic, and Clara felt herself growing stronger in her new role. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing the progress on one of the initiatives, her phone buzzed. It was a call from David. She hadn't heard from him in weeks. The last time they'd spoken had been when he had called her homeless after the fire. She had braced herself for the worst, but she picked up the phone anyway. "Mom?" His voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. I, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for how I treated you after the fire. I've been thinking about it, and I regret pushing you away like that." Clara listened, her stomach tightening. It was the apology she had wanted to hear. But it didn't have the weight she'd imagined. The anger she'd held onto for so long had faded, but it had been replaced by something else: detachment. She wasn't angry anymore, but she didn't feel the same closeness to David. The wound had healed, but the scar remained. "I appreciate that, David," Clara said, her voice steady but distant. "But I'm not sure I'm the same person I was when you last saw me. Things have changed. For both of us." There was a long pause, and she could hear him on the other end, trying to find the words. Finally, he said, "I guess I get that. But I want to try again. Maybe we can start over?" Clara didn't respond immediately. She didn't know if she could go back to who they were before. Her life was different now, and David's role in it, however important, was shifting. "I'll think about it," she said softly, and hung up without another word. As she sat back in her chair, the weight of his apology settled around her. She had hoped for a clean break, for some resolution that would heal the hurt. But now it felt like something was still unresolved. But Clara knew she had made progress. She was no longer trapped in the past, no longer defined by the farm she had lost. Her life now had a different purpose, one that wasn't tied to the land she had walked away from. Later that week, Jack called her again, checking in on her progress. When she mentioned the mentoring program, her voice was filled with pride. Jack's response was immediate, filled with encouragement. "Clara, you're doing exactly what you were meant to do. You're helping to shape the next generation of farmers, and you're doing it in a way that's bigger than you ever imagined." Clara smiled at his words, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had found her place again. This new chapter of her life was starting to make sense. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was hers to shape. She was still learning, still growing, but she was no longer alone in the journey. She had found her way, and it was leading her to something she never expected. The morning of the sustainability conference arrived with a strange mix of excitement and nerves. Clara sat backstage, her fingers curled tightly around the speech she had written, her eyes scanning the room beyond the curtain. The ballroom was buzzing with energy, filled with experts, environmental leaders, and philanthropists. They were all gathered to discuss the future of sustainable farming, a future Clara had been actively shaping for the past several months. Her heart pounded, her throat tight. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The opportunity to stand in front of this audience was everything she had worked for since her life had been upended by the fire. She had a story to tell, a story that wasn't just about loss, but about resilience, about rebuilding something greater than herself. The stage manager's voice cut through her thoughts. "You're up in 5 minutes, Clara." Clara nodded, though she didn't feel quite ready. She had faced challenges in her life, managing a farm, raising a son. But speaking in front of an audience like this felt like the hardest thing she had ever done. She had always been more comfortable in the background, working quietly with her hands, not in the spotlight. But now, this was her moment to step forward and share her journey with the world. She took a deep breath and walked to the podium. As she stepped into the light, a rush of warmth enveloped her, and for a brief moment she almost forgot the room was full of people. The audience was a blur of faces, all focused on her. Her palms were sweaty, her nerves threatening to take over, but she steadied herself and began. "Good morning," Clara began, her voice steady but not without hesitation. "I'm Clara Williams. I spent most of my life working a farm in a small town, doing what I knew best, tending to the land, growing food, and raising my family." She paused, letting the simplicity of those words sink in. "The land taught me a lot. It taught me about patience, about the seasons, and about the deep, quiet power of nature. But it also taught me that nothing is guaranteed, that sometimes we lose everything." She inhaled deeply, her chest tight. The memory of the fire, of standing in the driveway watching her life go up in smoke, flashed before her eyes. But she didn't look away. She had learned not to. "I thought I'd lost it all. I thought my life's work had been reduced to ash. But what I learned was that sometimes the hardest losses make way for something even greater." Clara's voice grew stronger, more sure. "I was given the chance to rebuild, not just my life, but my purpose." As she spoke, Clara felt herself shedding the weight of the past. She was no longer just the woman who had lost her farm. She was the woman who had rebuilt herself, the woman who was using her experience to change the future of farming. The crowd listened intently, captivated by her authenticity. She wasn't a polished corporate speaker or a celebrity with a prepared speech. She was just Clara, standing before them, telling her truth. Clara shared her journey, how she had joined the Sustainable Farming Initiative, how she had struggled at first to learn the language of technology and innovation, and how she had found a new purpose in helping other farmers adapt. She spoke of the young farmers she mentored, of the new methods she had learned, and of the hope she had found in working to make farming not just sustainable, but regenerative. "I believe we can do more than just preserve the land," Clara continued, her voice growing more impassioned. "We can restore it. We can make it thrive again for the next generation." The room was silent for a moment, and Clara let the words settle. She had said what she needed to say. The rest was out of her hands. As she finished, the applause was overwhelming. Clara blinked back the sudden sting of tears, her heart swelling with pride. She had done it. She had shared her story, not as a woman who had lost everything, but as a woman who had found something even greater. And in doing so, she had connected with the audience in a way she hadn't expected. After the speech, Several people approached her, their faces filled with admiration. Environmental leaders, farmers, and investors wanted to talk to her about her work, about future collaborations. She was no longer just a participant in the conversation. She was leading it. One man, an older gentleman with glasses and a weathered smile, extended his hand. "Clara, that was incredible. We've been looking for someone like you, someone with real experience, who can bring a grounded perspective to the sustainable farming movement. I'd love to discuss how we can collaborate on future projects." Clara shook his hand, a sense of accomplishment settling in her chest. She hadn't expected this kind of attention, but it felt right. She was making a difference. Her voice, her story, was finally being heard. As the conversations continued, Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her. She was no longer the woman defined by loss. She was the woman who was shaping the future, who was using her experience to help others, and in turn, helping herself heal. Later that evening, as Clara sat alone in her hotel room, she took a moment to reflect on everything that had led her to this point. David had called her recently, apologizing for his behavior after the fire. She appreciated his words, but they hadn't changed anything. He had made his choices, and Clara had made hers. She was no longer waiting for anyone to validate her. She was doing it for herself. As she scrolled through the messages of congratulations and offers from potential partners, Clara smiled. This was just the beginning. She had found her purpose again, and now the world was listening. The momentum Clara had gained from her speech at the sustainability conference carried her forward in ways she hadn't expected. Every day, she found herself more deeply involved in the sustainable farming project, and her role was becoming more influential. It was as if the world had finally caught up to her, recognizing the value of her experience in a new context. Her name was beginning to spread in the environmental community, whispered among peers, discussed in boardrooms. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a force, contributing to the future of farming in ways she never imagined possible. Her work with the young farmers continued, each day reinforcing her belief that her purpose lay in shaping the next generation of agriculture. Clara had developed a sense of belonging within this world, a stark contrast to the sense of displacement she had felt just a few months ago. She was finally making a mark, one that went beyond what she had lost. Then, one evening, her phone rang. The number on the screen made her heart drop for a split second. David. After his apology, she hadn't heard much from him. She had expected him to respect her space, but the familiar, heavy weight of unresolved tension hung in the air. Clara hesitated, unsure of what to expect. Still, she answered. "Mom, I know it's been a while." David's voice was tentative, the words slow and measured. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, and I realize that we've both changed. I'd like to meet, if that's possible. I just want to talk about the future." The request hung in the air, the years of bitterness and regret still tangled in Clara's chest. The memories of their last interaction, when he had turned his back on her during the fire, felt fresh despite the months that had passed. She swallowed hard, feeling a tightness in her throat. "I'm not sure, David. Things are different now." She could hear the disappointment in his voice, but it was quickly masked by a surge of determination. "I understand, but I think we should talk. I don't want to keep pretending like nothing happened." Clara closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing on her. She knew she couldn't stay angry forever, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to open that door again. Still, she had made progress. She wasn't the same woman she had been when he left her in the rubble of the farm. She was stronger now, and perhaps that strength was the key to healing, to rebuilding that relationship on new ground. "All right," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We'll meet, but on my terms." David agreed, and they set a date to meet in a local cafe. As Clara hung up, she felt a strange sense of closure settling over her. She wasn't waiting for him to redeem himself anymore. She wasn't waiting for anyone. But perhaps this meeting could be about understanding, about letting go of the final remnants of resentment. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about moving forward. The following week, Clara found herself having dinner with Sophie Armstrong, Elliot's daughter, in the bright, airy kitchen of Elliot's estate. The evening light filtered through the open windows, casting long shadows across the table. Sophie had become one of the people Clara had come to admire, not just because of her family's success, but because Sophie saw the world in a way that Clara hadn't been able to for a long time. She was the bridge between Clara's old world and her new one. "You're doing so much more than I thought you would," Sophie said, leaning forward, a look of admiration in her eyes. "You've built something out of nothing, Clara. It's incredible." Clara smiled, feeling the warmth of Sophie's words. "I'm still figuring it out, honestly. I never imagined this. Never imagined I'd be standing at the forefront of this movement." "You deserve to be," Sophie said. "I've watched you evolve. And what's even more incredible is how you've managed to help others evolve with you." Clara nodded, thinking of the young farmers she mentored, the projects she had initiated, and the new sense of purpose that guided her. She had created something bigger than the loss of her farm, something that would continue to grow, long after the scars of the past faded. A few days later, Clara received an invitation to the prestigious environmental gala Sophie had mentioned. The invitation was an acknowledgement of the impact Clara was having in the sustainable farming sector. As she read the elegant invitation, her heart skipped a beat. This was more than just a gathering. It was a symbol of her arrival, her recognition in a field she never thought she'd be part of. At the gala, Clara felt a buzz of anticipation in the air. The ballroom was filled with environmental leaders, scientists, and philanthropists. She walked into the grand hall, her dress simple but elegant, her heels clicking on the polished marble floor. Every conversation felt like a potential opportunity. As she moved through the room, a familiar face caught her eye. It was Ethan, one of the old farmhands who had worked with her husband. He had been part of the crew that kept the farm running before the fire. Seeing him now, his face worn with age but still carrying that same gentle energy, flooded Clara with memories of long hours spent in the fields, of the camaraderie that had defined her life before the loss. Ethan spotted her, too, and a warm smile spread across his face. "Clara, is that really you?" he asked, his voice filled with surprise and something deeper: nostalgia. "I didn't expect to see you here," Clara said, her voice shaky. "It's been so long." Ethan looked around the grand ballroom, his smile tinged with sadness. "You've come a long way, Clara. I knew you'd be back to doing what you love, just didn't expect it to be like this." Clara felt a knot form in her throat. In that moment, she realized that even as the world changed, some things remained constant, like the relationships she had built and the work that had defined her life. "I guess I've been finding my way," Clara said softly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the crowd. Ethan nodded, and for a moment, they stood there together, the years between them slipping away, reminding Clara of the legacy she had built and the new one she was now creating. Clara stood at the window of her office, gazing out at the sprawling green fields that stretched beyond the horizon. It had become her ritual, the quiet moments of reflection before the storm of work began each day. The steady hum of the office behind her, filled with colleagues and collaborators, felt like a distant echo in her mind. Her thoughts were fixed on the invitation that had come earlier that morning, an offer to join the board of directors for the sustainable farming initiative she had helped pioneer. It was a huge honor, a recognition of her work, her passion, and her dedication. But it was also a heavy weight, one she wasn't sure she was ready to carry. The offer had come from Jack, his voice filled with excitement as he told her, "Clara, this is what you've worked for. You've built something real here, something that can change the future of farming. This board position will put you at the center of it all. It's your chance to shape the direction of the industry." But the weight of the responsibility loomed large. Clara had spent years dedicating herself to the land, to the people who worked with her, and to the mission of sustainability. Now she was being asked to lead, to steer the ship. It was a position that would require her to juggle the business side of the industry with her passion for the land. It would mean more time away from the young farmers she mentored, more time away from the hands-on work she loved. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was an email, an invitation to return to her hometown. The small community that had once been the center of her world, the place where her life had been built, was now calling her back to honor her contributions to sustainable farming. The words seemed to shimmer on the screen. "We would be honored to have you as the guest of honor at a ceremony recognizing your work in the field of sustainable agriculture. Your efforts have inspired countless people and changed the course of farming in our region." Clara read the email 3 times, a mixture of emotions stirring within her. Part of her was proud, proud that her small town, the very place that had once felt so stifling, was now acknowledging her efforts. But another part of her felt a strange sense of detachment. The town had never truly understood her before. They had seen her as a simple farmer, a woman tied to the land, not the leader of a movement. And yet, she had been invited back as someone who had made a difference, a recognition she had never thought possible. She leaned back in her chair, contemplating the crossroads she now found herself at. The board seat was a step into a future she couldn't have imagined when she first arrived in this new world of sustainability, but it was also a sacrifice of time, of connection, of simplicity. It would pull her away from the life she had fought to rebuild, a life that, while different, still felt grounded in her love for the land. "Clara?" Sophie's voice broke through her reverie. She had entered the room quietly, standing in the doorway with a soft smile on her face. Sophie had been a constant support, someone who understood the complexities of Clara's world in a way no one else could. "You look deep in thought. Everything all right?" Clara sighed, turning toward her. "I've been offered a seat on the board. It's everything I've worked for. But I'm not sure if it's the right thing for me. It's a huge responsibility, Sophie. I'm afraid I'll lose touch with the things that matter most." Sophie stepped into the room, crossing to the window where Clara stood. "I can see how it would be overwhelming," she said softly. "But you've always been someone who's willing to step up, to take on what others won't. This could be the next chapter for you, a chance to influence so much more than you ever could alone." Clara nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Maybe. But at what cost? I'm already giving so much. I'm not sure how much more I can sacrifice." Sophie's expression softened. "I get it. But Clara, think about all the people you've already helped, those young farmers, the communities you've touched. This could be your chance to expand that impact, to bring others along with you." Clara's gaze drifted back to the fields outside. She had come so far. But was she ready to leave the life she had built with her own hands in order to become a symbol of something much larger? A week later, Clara stood in front of the small town hall, the place where she had spent so many years watching the seasons change, where she had been both a daughter and a mother, a wife and a worker. The people who filled the seats before her were familiar faces, old friends, neighbors, former colleagues. They had come to honor her for her contributions to sustainable farming, for the way she had turned her personal tragedy into a mission that impacted not just her farm, but communities around the world. She was introduced by the mayor, a man who had once criticized her for her unconventional methods, now standing proudly beside her. Clara smiled at him, feeling the weight of the moment. The community was no longer just acknowledging her past, they were celebrating her present and the future she had helped create. As Clara took the stage, she was surprised to find herself nervous. Her past, her farm, her family, it all came rushing back. She took a deep breath and began, "Thank you for this honor. I never imagined I'd be standing here, in front of all of you, being recognized for something I thought was just my life's work. But what I've learned, what I've come to realize, is that the work never ends. It's about the next generation, the future of the land, and that's what keeps me going." Her voice cracked slightly, but Clara quickly regained composure. "I've learned that the greatest gift we can give to the land, to the future, is to leave it better than we found it. That's why I'm here today, why I've chosen to continue this work, to help others carry the torch." The applause that followed was deafening, but Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet detachment. She had come so far, but in that moment, she realized that some relationships, no matter how much time had passed, couldn't be fully healed. David's face appeared in the crowd, his eyes focused on her, his family beside him. He wasn't just watching his mother, he was watching the woman she had become, someone beyond the son who had turned his back. After the ceremony, David approached Clara. His eyes were filled with regret, and the words he had been rehearsing came out quietly. "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. I don't know how to make it right, but I wish I had done more." Clara looked at him, the woman who had once needed his approval now standing firm in her own. "I know, David, and it's okay. I've forgiven you. But some things can't go back to the way they were." She touched his arm gently, but there was a space between them, one that could never be fully bridged. As Clara left the stage, the weight of the past settled around her. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she was confident she could face it. Clara sat at her desk, the papers spread before her, the weight of the moment sinking in. She had spent her life working the land, fighting for what was hers. And now, after everything, she was on the verge of something even greater. The policy board's documents, which had arrived that morning, lay before her, ready to finalize her role on the board of directors for the Sustainable Farming Initiative. It was a role that would not only give her a voice, but a platform, a seat at the table where decisions that shaped the future of agriculture were made. She held the pen in her hand, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. The old Clara, the one who had been unsure, who had felt the weight of every failure and setback, would have hesitated. She would have questioned her worth, her place in this new world. But this Clara, she wasn't that woman anymore. The fire, the loss, the betrayal, all of it had forged her into someone stronger. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a force in the world of sustainable agriculture. Clara signed the papers with a steady hand, feeling the finality of the gesture as the ink bled into the crisp white paper. This was it. She had earned her place at the table, and now she was ready to take the next step. Jack's voice echoed in her mind from earlier that day when they spoke about the offer. "Clara, do you know what this means? This is more than just a position. It's your chance to lead, to shape the future. You're not just a woman rebuilding her life. You're someone changing the landscape of farming. You're a force, Clara." The words held a weight she hadn't fully understood until now. She's no longer just a survivor. She wasn't just someone who had been knocked down, struggling to find her way. She was someone who had risen, who had shaped a new future, not just for herself, but for others. Later that afternoon, Clara made her way to the local women's co-op. It was a small group that had recently reached out to her, inspired by her work and interested in replicating her model of sustainable farming. She had agreed to meet them and share what she had learned in her own journey, but she didn't expect the turnout. The room was packed, women from all walks of life, many of them farmers or small business owners, eager to learn from someone who had managed to turn tragedy into triumph. Clara stood at the front of the room, her hands resting lightly on the podium as the crowd quieted. Her gaze swept over the faces before her, curious, hopeful, expectant. She took a deep breath, feeling the rush of nerves that always came before speaking in front of a crowd. But there was something different now. This wasn't about proving herself. It was about sharing her story, her knowledge, and her experience. She began, her voice strong and clear. When I started this journey, I didn't have all the answers. In fact, I had no idea where it would take me. I had a farm, a family, a life, but then I lost it all. What I've learned since then, though, is that sustainability isn't just about the environment. It's about creating something that can stand the test of time, something that can grow and evolve, no matter what life throws at you. Clara continued, sharing the practical, hands-on methods she had developed over the years: how to nurture the soil, how to use technology to improve crop yields while keeping sustainability at the forefront, and how to make farming more resilient in the face of climate change. The room was silent, the women hanging on her every word. She was no longer just a teacher. She was a mentor, a guide for a new generation of farmers who wanted to make a difference. As she finished her talk, the room erupted in applause, and Clara felt a rush of pride and gratitude wash over her. She had done more than teach them methods and techniques. She had inspired them. She had given them hope. That night, as Clara sat in her hotel room, she checked her phone. There was a message from David. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was clear. "Proud of you, Mom." For a moment, Clara simply stared at the message. She hadn't expected anything from him, certainly not this. Her mind raced back to their last conversation, to the distance that had grown between them. She had forgiven him. But forgiveness didn't mean things would go back to how they were. She wasn't the same woman anymore, and neither was he. The words, "Proud of you, Mom," hung in the air, an acknowledgement of her journey, of the woman she had become. Clara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her journey had always been about finding her own way, without waiting for approval from anyone, least of all her son. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a notification from the policy board. "We are pleased to confirm your appointment to the board of directors. Welcome aboard, Clara. Together, we will build a sustainable future." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with pride. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. The moment she had worked so hard for. And now, it was official. She was more than just a survivor. She was a leader, shaping the future of farming and sustainability. As she looked out the window, the city lights twinkling below her, Clara felt a quiet sense of peace. She wasn't looking back anymore. She was looking forward, toward a future she had created, a future that was hers to shape. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer defined her. She had reclaimed her power, and she was just getting started. Clara sat at her kitchen table, the book proposal in front of her, her pen hovering uncertainly over the first page. It was an exciting opportunity, a book deal that would turn her journey into a published memoir, the story of her life, the fire, the loss, and her rise from the ashes to become a leader in the world of sustainable agriculture. But as she stared at the blank page, doubt crept in. Could she really put her life into words? Could she capture the complexity of everything she had been through? The pain, the struggle, and now, the triumph. The offer had come from a respected publishing house, and though the idea of sharing her story with the world thrilled her, it also terrified her. Writing a book was different than speaking at a conference or mentoring farmers. It was personal. It meant digging deep into the parts of her past that she had spent so long burying. Could she expose those raw, unhealed wounds for public consumption? Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Jack. Clara, I just heard about the book deal. That's amazing. You're going to inspire so many more people. And don't forget, you've got a team behind you now. Support, guidance, everything you need. Clara smiled at his enthusiastic words. Jack had always been a steady ally, someone who encouraged her to reach higher. But still, the idea of telling her story in full was daunting. Taking a deep breath, Clara made a decision. She would do it. But she needed help. Someone who could help her tell the story. Someone who could translate her lived experiences into something powerful. She hired a young ghostwriter, Elise, who had come highly recommended. Elise was in her early 20s, sharp-eyed and eager, with an air of quiet confidence. When they first met, Elise shared that her own mother had been a farmer who had lost her land. It wasn't just business for her, it was personal too. The moment they began to work together, Clara felt a strange bond form between them. Elise was professional but kind, sharp but patient. And as they spent hours discussing Clara's life, Elise's understanding grew. And Clara found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. There were moments when Clara would pause, overwhelmed by emotion, but Elise would just nod, offering gentle support. The relationship shifted in subtle, powerful ways. Elise wasn't just a collaborator. She became a confidant, a surrogate daughter, in a way Clara had never anticipated. The two of them would often sit together late into the evening, brainstorming chapter outlines, discussing what Clara wanted to convey, and sharing pieces of their own personal histories. Elise, in many ways, became the daughter Clara had lost when David pulled away. As the months passed and the manuscript began to take shape, corporate pushback on Clara's sustainable farming proposals started to intensify. The large agribusinesses that dominated the farming industry were beginning to see Clara as a threat. They didn't like the way she was challenging the status quo, the way she was advocating for farming practices that prioritized the environment over profits. One afternoon, Clara was scheduled to speak at a town hall meeting about the future of agriculture in her region. She was excited, ready to defend her ideas, but the tension was thick in the air. The corporate lobbyists had shown up in full force, their voices louder than ever before. They had come prepared with their own set of numbers, statistics, and arguments to undermine Clara's sustainable farming approach. When the time came for Clara to speak, she took the stage, her heart pounding. The lobbyists wasted no time. A representative from a major agricultural corporation stood up, pointing to a slide on the projector screen that painted sustainable farming as an unrealistic, costly dream. "You can't save the planet and feed the world with your methods," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Clara's hands clenched at her sides. She had heard these arguments before, too many times to count. But this time, she wasn't intimidated. With a calm, unwavering voice, Clara stepped forward. "You're right about one thing," she began, addressing the room. "We can't keep doing things the way we always have. And if we keep listening to people who have a vested interest in the status quo, we'll never change anything. The way we farm must change. It's not just about feeding the world, it's about feeding it sustainably. For the long haul." The room went quiet. Clara stood tall, her voice growing in strength. She spoke about the importance of innovation, of using technology and data to help farmers grow crops without depleting the land. She explained how regenerative farming could improve soil health and increase biodiversity, and how small farms could thrive alongside the larger industrial operations if they were given the tools and support they needed. She talked about the legacy she wanted to leave, not just for her children, but for every person who would depend on the land for generations to come. As Clara spoke, her words rang with clarity and authority. She had spent years struggling with doubt, but now she was confident. She wasn't just a woman advocating for sustainable agriculture. She was the voice of a movement. When she finished, there was a long, tense silence. Then the room erupted in applause. The speech went viral. Media outlets picked up the story, calling her the Phoenix Farmer for her ability to rise from the ashes of personal loss to become a powerful advocate for change. Articles were written, interviews were scheduled, and Clara's influence grew by the day. She had done it. She had stood her ground and made her case, and the world was listening. As Clara left the town hall, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Elise. "You were amazing today. I'm so proud of you." Clara smiled, knowing that it wasn't just her strength that had gotten her this far. It was the strength of those who had believed in her, who had supported her along the way. But as she walked to her car, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over, and the challenges ahead were only going to get tougher. But Clara was ready. She had reclaimed her power, and now she was unstoppable. The smear campaign had begun quietly, as these things often did. At first, it was just a whisper, small, subtle comments from the corporate lobbyists, insinuations about Clara's methods and motivations. But as her influence grew, so did the attacks. Articles appeared in agricultural magazines with titles like "The Danger of the Phoenix Farmer's Vision" and "Regenerative Farming, a Risk to Food Security." The narrative was clear. Clara was naive, reckless, and her methods were unsustainable for the future of global agriculture. Clara ignored it all. She had learned the hard way to keep moving forward, no matter how loud the criticism grew. It wasn't the first time people had doubted her, and it wouldn't be the last. Besides, her work spoke for itself. But Elise, her ghostwriter and now a close confidant, couldn't let it go. The young woman had been with Clara through so much, helping to shape her story, writing her memoir, and offering support every step of the way. Elise was fierce, protective of Clara as if she were a daughter, and the attacks on her mentor felt personal. "Clara," Elise said one afternoon, her voice sharp as they sat in Clara's study, reviewing the next chapter of the book. This is ridiculous. These people are trying to tear you down because they're scared of what you represent. I'm going to respond. I'll write something. Send it out." Clara glanced up, her eyes soft but resolute. "Elise, we've been through this. I'm not fighting back. I'm not giving them what they want. Let it go. Let them rot." "But they're lying about you, Clara," Elise protested, her face flushed with emotion. "They're telling people you're some kind of fraud, that everything you've worked for is dangerous. How can you just let them get away with it?" Clara sighed deeply, leaning back in her chair. "I can't change their minds, Elise. I can't spend my time worrying about what they're saying. I'm going to keep doing the work. That's all that matters." Elise's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue further. She respected Clara's wish, though it pained her. The bond between them had only grown stronger over the months, as they pored over every detail of Clara's life and transformed it into a story that felt more like a shared dream than a project. Elise had become more than just a writer. She had become the daughter Clara never had. That evening, as Clara sat in her office, reviewing the pages of the first draft of her book, a message from Elliot popped up on her screen. It was a short text, simple but comforting. "Let the past rot. The future is yours." Clara read the words again, the sting of everything that had happened with her family now dulled by time. Elliot's words were a reminder that she didn't need anyone's approval anymore. Not from David, not from anyone. The past was a shadow, and the future was hers to shape. She smiled, feeling a rare flicker of peace. Her past had taught her painful lessons, but it had also prepared her for this moment. The next morning, Clara appeared on a podcast hosted by a well-known environmental leader. It was the first time she had openly discussed her experiences with generational betrayal, though she carefully avoided naming any names. Still, her words were clear enough. "I've spent my life working the land, but there's something I've come to realize," Clara said into the microphone, her voice steady and sure. "The people who benefit from the old systems, those who profit off the exploitation of the land, will always fight to keep things the way they are. But we, the ones who've been pushed aside, who've been ignored, we have to change the story. We can't wait for permission. We have to build a new future, one that's better for the next generation." Her words resonated with the listeners, spreading like wildfire across social media. The Phoenix farmer became a symbol of hope, a rallying cry for those who had been overlooked for far too long. Later that afternoon, Clara's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from her lawyer. "Clara," the voice on the other end said, "you've just been awarded a grant, a significant one. The board has approved funding for a new initiative, women-led agricultural programs, under your name." Clara's breath caught in her throat. A grant that would fund her vision, her mission, was exactly the kind of recognition she needed. It wasn't just about her success. It was about lifting others up, creating opportunities for women in agriculture, and giving them the resources they needed to succeed. "That's incredible," she said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. "Thank you." As the call ended, Clara looked out the window of her office, her mind racing with possibilities. The weight of everything she had overcome, the people who had tried to tear her down, the battles she had fought, all of it felt worth it now. She had become a force. And now, she was going to help change the future for others. But as Clara sat back, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from David. A short, simple note. "Can we talk, Mom? Please." Clara's heart fluttered, but this time there was no hesitation. She didn't know if she was ready to reopen the past, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't the same woman anymore. She had forged a new life, a new legacy. Whatever came next, she was prepared to face it, head on. The challenges weren't over. But Clara had reclaimed her power, and nothing could take that away. Clara stared at the stack of books on her kitchen counter, the cover of Ashes to Acres staring back at her with a quiet intensity. The book was officially released, and within a week, it had skyrocketed to the top of the bestseller lists. She could hardly believe it. What had started as a story of pain, loss, and rebuilding was now a beacon for others who, like her, were trying to find their way after everything had fallen apart. The media whirlwind that followed felt surreal. Morning shows, podcasts, panel discussions. Clara was everywhere, speaking with a calm conviction that she hadn't known she possessed until now. She had become the face of sustainable agriculture, the one people turned to when they wanted to understand how to balance environmental preservation with feeding the world. Every interview was a performance, but Clara had learned to keep her poise. The questions came fast and furious. "What do you say to those who still think regenerative farming is too risky? How do you deal with the corporate pushback?" But there was one question that came up more than any other, and it was the one Clara was always prepared for. "Do you have any words for your son and daughter-in-law? They've publicly distanced themselves from you. How do you feel about that?" The first time it was asked, Clara had felt a pang deep inside, a brief, unwelcome stir of emotion that she quickly suppressed. But the more the question came, the more detached she became. She never answered it directly. Instead, she spoke about the future, about the children who would inherit the earth, about the work that still needed to be done. Her gaze always remained forward, never back. And then, there was Lily. Clara hadn't expected to hear from David or Emma. She wasn't even sure she wanted to. But when the letter arrived from Lily, David's daughter, Clara felt her heart twist. "Dear Grandma Clara," the letter began, written in a messy, childlike scrawl. "I just wanted to thank you for being so strong. I don't understand why things happened the way they did, but I know you didn't have to be so brave. You're helping so many people, and you're my hero. Thank you for not giving up." The letter was short, but it hit Clara like a wave. She hadn't expected gratitude, not from David's family. She had long since accepted that their relationship was fractured, irreparable. But Lily, still a child, had seen something in Clara she hadn't known was there. In a way, Lily was the one who had given Clara the closure she hadn't realized she needed. As Clara sat on her couch, reading the letter again, a new idea began to take root in her mind. She wasn't going to let Lily be left behind. Not like this. The child had every right to a future that was as bright and nurturing as the land she would one day inherit. Clara picked up the phone, her heart racing with a sudden sense of purpose. She made the arrangements quietly, without fanfare, ensuring that it would be a gift without any strings attached. Lily would spend the summer at an agricultural camp, learning about sustainable farming in a hands-on environment. Clara had established a scholarship in her own mother's name, an anonymous gift that would send Lily to the camp, where she could experience firsthand the values Clara had spent her life fighting for. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't about mending old wounds. It was about giving Lily the chance to become the person she was meant to be, untainted by the bitterness of the past. The media continued to buzz, and Clara's speaking tour was in full swing. She had recently been invited to speak at a major environmental conference, and the fee for her appearance was substantial. Clara, who had never cared for wealth or recognition, decided to put it to use. The money from her speaking engagements funded 5 new community garden projects, spread across different states, where people could come together to learn about sustainable practices and grow their own food. Each garden was a seed, planted in the soil of a community, tended by people who understood the power of the earth. These gardens weren't just about food, they were about connection, about rebuilding what had been lost. Clara's face might be everywhere now, her name synonymous with hope for a sustainable future, but these gardens were her true legacy. And so, as Clara sat on the stage for yet another interview, poised and graceful, the feeling of fulfillment washed over her. She had done it. She had rebuilt not just her life, but an entire movement, one rooted in the land she had once lost and now helped to restore. She had created something that would outlast her, a testament to everything she had fought for. But it was not just the public victories that mattered. It was the quiet, invisible work, the scholarships, the gardens, the hope she had rekindled in others that made her realize that her true legacy was not in the headlines or the accolades. It was in the lasting change she was helping to create. As she signed off from the interview, a thought struck her. She hadn't just rebuilt her life, she had reshaped her future, and in doing so, she had given others the tools to reshape theirs. And as she watched the camera crew pack up, Clara knew that she was just getting started. Her legacy was no longer defined by the ashes of her past. It was in the fertile soil of the future, where the seeds of her work would grow, long after she was gone. The bright lights of the national stage glinted off Clara's navy blue suit as she walked to the podium. The applause from the audience seemed to reverberate in her chest, as if it came from a place deeper than the room itself. She had imagined this moment countless times, standing before an audience of thousands, speaking not just for herself, but for a movement she had birthed from the ashes of everything she had lost. Her breath was steady as she placed the pages of her speech on the podium, her hands sure as they adjusted the microphone. The hum of the room began to fade, the rustling of the crowd quieting as Clara raised her head to face them. She had come a long way since the fire, a long way since the moment her life had crumbled into smoke and ruin. But now, standing here, Clara felt something more than pride. She felt a deep, unshakable sense of purpose. She was no longer the woman who had lost everything. She was the woman who had rebuilt not just her life, but the very future of sustainable agriculture. Her voice rang clear as she began. We live in a world that demands change. A world where the old ways of farming are no longer enough to sustain us, or the planet. I am here today to speak not of what we've lost, but of what we can still gain. A future where we can nourish both the land and the people who rely on it. Her words flowed effortlessly, honed from years of hard-won wisdom. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had seen the darkness and had learned to rise from it. The audience listened with rapt attention as she shared her journey, her loss, her grief, and ultimately, her transformation into the voice of a new generation of farmers. I am not a hero, she continued. I'm just someone who found the strength to keep going, to rebuild, to believe that the land we care for today can feed tomorrow's children. Her eyes scanned the crowd, meeting the gaze of countless people who had come to hear her story. The standing ovation that followed was deafening. Clara stood there for a moment, letting the applause wash over her. She had never been one for the spotlight, but now, in this moment, she realized that it wasn't just about her. It was about the countless farmers who had come before her, and the ones she was inspiring now. This was bigger than her story. This was a movement. As the crowd's cheers slowly tapered off, Clara caught sight of Jack in the front row, his eyes fixed on her with pride. Elise stood backstage, her hands clasped together, her face shining with tears of joy. The women who had supported Clara every step of the way, who had helped her find her voice, were now witnessing the full circle of everything Clara had worked for. Clara took a deep breath, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had done it. She had become the woman she was always meant to be. And then, as the audience quieted, Clara's eyes scanned the crowd again. There, in the back row, she saw a face that stopped her cold. David. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with something she couldn't quite place. Regret, admiration, and a depth of emotion that had been absent for so long. He clapped the hardest when the applause came. His hands were loud in the silence that followed, but Clara didn't feel anger, not this time. Instead, she felt a quiet release. She had forgiven him long ago, not for him, but for herself. She didn't need him to validate her anymore. But it was clear that somehow, in this moment, he had come to see her for who she truly was. The weight of everything she had been through, the fire, the abandonment, the betrayal, had finally settled into something lighter. Clara had spent years waiting for closure, waiting for the world to recognize her worth. But she realized now that she had never needed anyone's approval to become who she was meant to be. When the speech was over and the crowd began to disperse, Clara found herself standing in the same spot, taking it all in. She felt at peace. This was her moment, her legacy, built from nothing but sheer determination and the belief that she could make a difference. That night, as she returned to her home, it wasn't the grand estate or the flashy awards that mattered. It was the quiet, modest farmhouse she had chosen, the one that wasn't built on the ashes of her past, but on the foundation of everything she had rebuilt. Clara sat in the soft light of her kitchen, gazing out at the land she had come to love once more. It wasn't the farm she had lost, but it was a place that felt like home. A place where she could plant new seeds, nurture new growth, and watch the world change around her. As she sipped her tea, Clara smiled softly to herself. The weight of the world's expectations now lifted from her shoulders. Her journey had only just begun, but this time she was walking into the future, not with fear, but with the unwavering confidence of a woman who had reclaimed her power. My farm burned down. My son and daughter-in-law called me homeless. So I called the billionaire I used to babysit, and I became the woman they'll never forget.